Hey everyone, my name is Azo, and in this video, I will give you an aggressive guide to the London system. I believe the London is often dismissed as a so-called boring opening, and I hope to offer some new perspective. So the first thing to know is the default structure. It starts with d4 followed by bishop f4 to put the bishop outside the pawn chain. Then in some move order, we are going to support d4 very well, get our knights to d2 and f3, get our bishop to d3, and maybe castle. And with that, we are on to the main part of the video. How can we create attacking chances? I'm going to show 4 very nice games and I will break down all the key ideas. So let's start with a game between two chess giants, Grandmaster Walter Brown versus Grandmaster Bent Larsen. And the first key idea can be seen as early as move 3. Whenever black tries to attack your d4 pawn with c5 in the London, you want to defend it with e3 rather than c3. The issue with c3 is that the pawn structure will become a little bit too symmetrical and it's difficult to create your attacking chances. e3 in comparison creates what appears to be a tiny asymmetry, but it actually sets the game in a completely different direction. What's going to happen is that eventually white would have their pawn structure pointed towards the king side and would be best positioned to go for a kingside attack, whereas black would be best advised to go for a queenside attack. And the opposite side attack should create an interesting battle. A couple moves later, white played queen b3 to attack b7, and black defended it with queen to c8 rather than queen to d7, which might run into knight e5 or bishop b5 at some point. So queen c8, and skipping ahead a few more moves, both sides complete their development and the London setup is complete. And now the question is, how can white start an attack here? You can pause the video here to consider a few ideas. The way brown continued was knight to e5. And this is a critical London move to start any attack because you would either have a strong knight here, which can go after the bishop pair, or if this knight is taken, we would have a strong pawn on e5, which would control the f6 square, which means this knight has to go somewhere else, which means h7 will become a soft target. And so after queen c2, sure, black could defend it with h6, but now the light squares are a lot weaker, and this bishop does not have a good retreat square. Anyway, in the game, black did not take on e5, but instead retreated the bishop to g6 to bolster the light squares a little bit. The game continued knight f3, knight h5 to attack this bishop, and of course, white preserves the two bishops with bishop to e3. Now, one might think that white has wasted a move, having gone to f4, then e3. But the thing is, black had to play knight h5 to make us go back to e3, and it's not like the knight is doing very well on h5. The only potential square the knight has is f4. And so the thing we must bear in mind is, as soon as they threaten to go to f4, we have to shut it down with g3. And that's exactly what happened in the game. Following that, black played rook to c8, threatening knight to b4, exploiting this pin. So white gets out of the way while bringing more attackers to the e-file and the king side. And then now black goes for their queenside attack with a6 and b5. And of course, white continues to bring more attackers to the king side with rook a to e1 to control the e-file as well, which means that this bishop must move out of the way so that the pressure on the e-file can be felt. And now the question is, say after knight f6, which happened in the game, how can white make their presence on the e-file felt? Which square along the e-file could be exploited? You can pause the video if you'd like to consider this. The move white played here was knight to g5, going after e6 by attacking its key defender, f7. And so the threat is now to just sacrifice on f7, crash through on all the light squares, and checkmate black. So black had to play bishop d6 to laterally defend f7. And here we are well out of the opening phase, so I'll go through the rest of the game rather quickly. Here, white simply had to stop this e5 pawn break to maintain their monopoly over the e-file, then rerouted their knight to e5, and here the key targets would be black's g6 pawn as well as the critical h-file, which is very near black's king. And so white positioned all their pieces to go after those two targets. with king g2, an ingenious idea to eventually get the rook to h1. And a couple moves later, queen c2, and now you can see white's attack is coming into play. In fact, right here, white has sufficient pressure along the two weaknesses that rook h1 followed by h5 would be decisive. But white had a different idea and instead went queen to e2 and got in h5 anyway. Black got some compensation on the queen side, got some attack, but it wasn't sufficient and white's attack was much more deadly. And so here, now that white has gained full control over the h-file, the next thing to do is to add more attackers. And so the f-pawn got into the game, and after f takes e6, controlling f7, white has a dangerous threat of queen h8. For example, rook a8 or any innocuous move would be met with queen h8 followed by an elegant checkmate. So this e6 pawn had to be taken, but then white simply invaded, and a couple of moves later, after queen f5, black resigned because white has way too many attackers into the game and black isn't going to survive this. So the key takeaways from this game are imbalancing the pawn structure by defending against c5 with e3, and then later on playing knight to e5 because that's a key way to start our attack. And then from there, meeting knight h5 with bishop e3 to preserve the two bishops, prevent knight f4, and from there we see the setup necessary to take advantage of black's two weaknesses, that is the g6 pawn as well as the h-file. And they work together because the g6 pawn serves as an anchor for us to open up the h-file. The only things we need to do are to gain good control over the center so as to prevent any form of counterplay, then play this ingenious king g2 move so that we can have some additional support along the h-file. But this is not your only approach to attacking in the London. I can show you another game that started in a similar way, Emil Fischer versus Thomas Assmann, both master level players. So we have the same imbalanced pawn structure, and a couple moves later we see all our familiar moves and rook a to e1, which as we know is meant to control the half open file and offer some additional support to knight e5. And what you'll see here is that even though black finds a way to trade all the knights off and finds a way to trade off our attacking firepower, we still have very good checkmating chances, middle game checkmating chances. And the reason is our pawn structure. And concretely speaking, the absence of our e3 pawn allows our rooks to lift and slide over to the king side easily. And in comparison, black's e6 pawn prevents black from contesting the e-file and prevents black from bringing more defenders over to the king side. And so instead, naturally, black's best bet is to go for a queenside attack, while we should bring all our forces towards the king side, which includes our includes our queen, and includes the h-pawn. And the rationale behind this h-pawn sacrifice is to gain a little bit of time on this bishop and to also provide some extra room on the h-file. So these pieces can double or even triple up if necessary. So a couple moves later, all of white's major pieces get into position, and now what? What is white threatening here? You can pause the video if you like to think about it. White's threat is queen to h5, and just to show how that works, if black plays a random move, white has queen h5 to threaten queen h7 and queen h8 mate, and if the queen is taken, then comes a checkmate in 2. So instead of rook a8, black had to go f6 to defend g7, but then white simply continued their attack, continued to threaten some form of a checkmate so that black would not have time to take this bishop. So here rook takes g6, and again, black could not take this bishop because of rook f3. I'll just play it out on the board. Rook f3 followed by d takes e5, where now white is going to have a lot of attackers in the game. So black had to go king f8, and it got to a point where white was able to attack g7 sufficiently such that they could trade a rook and a bishop for a queen and 2 pawns. And the rest of the game was a matter of queening this past g pawn. So A few moves later, queen h7, and there's no stopping g6, g7, g8, and so black resigned. So yeah, this game is just to show another way to use this pawn structure to attack the king side by leveraging on this rook lift and attacking the two key targets, g6 and the h-file. And I want to stress that these two weaknesses are fairly common in the London, so long as black decides to put their bishop outside the pawn chain, that is putting it on f5 or g4 before playing e6. So we have already seen how bishop g4 leads to this structure. Basically, white would eventually go knight f3 to e5 and hunt this bishop down. And if black plays bishop to f5 instead, then simply a couple moves later, we will go knight to h4, and we will either get this pawn structure directly once again, or black could take the long way about it with bishop g4, and then capturing on g6. So the other possibility is if at the start, black were to leave their light squared bishop inside the pawn chain. And for that, we will be looking at the game Georgelis Alexandros versus Wunschreiner. Again, both master level players. And very early in the game, we can already see the first key difference. Black is playing e6, or the bishop is inside the pawn chain. And the advantage is that we can't go after this bishop, and b7 is also well protected, so there's no queen b3 to worry about. Anyway, we get our normal London setup with knight to e5 and black castled. And now I'd like to show yet another key attacking idea that white played in the game, h4, deliberately avoiding castling and instead going for a pawn storm on the king side. Additionally, the h4 pawn offers some support to the g5 square, and we'll see why this is so important in a minute. Here, black continued with what appears to be a harmless move, knight takes e5, but here black is already lost. Can you find the move for white? Can you find the combination for white? Pause the video if you need more time. The answer is d takes e5 to chase this knight away from the defense of h7 and then go with the Greek gift. And typically, the Greek gift requires our knight to be a lot closer to the action in order for it to work. But in this case, the position is so close and our position is so dominating that it doesn't matter that we are one move short. After queen h5, we can play the calm knight to f3, and there's no good answer to the threat of knight g5. The best black can try is f6, but still knight g5, and now we can see the merit of h4. That is, once this knight is captured, the h-pawn can recapture to open up the h-file and also prepare g6 to take away the f7 square and deliver mate eventually. So black had to return one piece to prevent this g6 move from happening, but white's attack remains very strong. And so in a couple of moves, white got all their pieces in and black resigned here because white is threatening to take away so many squares and get both rooks into the attack. And so the key takeaway from this game is this h4 move, which offers both the potential for a kingside pawn storm and a Greek gift sacrifice once this f6 knight is chased away. And to show that this bishop takes h7 idea is not a fluke, we are going to look at another game, Garakemsky versus Sam Shankland, a very famous game, and both are grandmasters. The game started pretty normal. White played bishop to g3 so that bishop takes g3 can be met with the opening of the h-file. A couple moves later, the usual knight e5 comes in and black challenges the e5 knight while potentially preparing f6 to kick it away. And here Kamsky comes up with a brilliant idea. You can pause the video if you want to try to find it. It's very complex and it starts with knight takes d7. And the idea is after this natural but incorrect bishop takes d7 move, white can drag black's queen all the way to c5 and now go for the Greek gift. And it looks like this knight is really far away once again, and we don't have our h4 pawn to help us. But then we see the purpose of bringing the queen to c5. That is, we are able to play knight e4 here to gain a tempo on the queen before going to g5. and we are also exploiting this pin on the d pawn. And the thing is, if this bishop on d7 weren't there, g6 would be a fine way to deal with this threat by counter-attacking the queen. But the issue is, after the queen trade, white is able to win this unprotected bishop on d7 and is going to go for a second pawn. So black's only option is to move the queen somewhere, and after knight g5, the rest is a matter of exploiting black's weak king position by adding a third attacker into the game. We have two attackers so far, we need a third one, and so white brought in the rook and then found a way to open up the foul by exploiting this pin. And once three attackers were in the game, once the queen, knight, and rook were all in the game, black was lost. And here, black resigned because after king c7 and knight e6 check, white is going to take this rook with check somehow and can always return to f3 to defend against all the threats against white's king. And that's all for your quick guide to playing the aggressive London system. To summarize, our key ideas are imbalancing the pawn structure, so meeting c takes d4 with e takes d4, as well as knight e5 to start an attack. And if you decide to castle, you can consider using this rook lift. If you don't castle, you can consider getting h4, h5 in. And of course, there's always the Greek gift to consider. So that's all for this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe for part 2, where I will discuss the London in greater detail.